Hi everyone, this is Sonora Slater and you're listening to Agricola with the California Aggie, UC Davis's student-run newspaper. Maybe you've read our articles online or picked up a paper from the newsstand inside Shields Library, but we're coming to you now in an audio format. I'm excited to dive into providing you a deeper look at the people, places, and events we cover every day at the Aggie, and I hope you enjoy listening. Before we dive into our main story, here's a look into this week's top headlines. Local music store Watermelon Music announced its closure 2 weeks ago, citing increasing costs despite steady sales. Meanwhile, on campus, UC Davis opened their new coffee center on May 3rd. It's the first research center of its kind in the country, and it plans to offer classes in fields like chemical engineering, plant science, and even sociology. Finally, the ASUCD Senate passed a resolution calling for the chancellor and administrators to respond to students on the renewal of the decision of the pouring rights contract with PepsiCo, a type of contract where a brand has exclusive or semi-exclusive rights to sell and market beverages in an institutional setting such as a university. Now, for this week's main story. I was feeling nostalgic for my days as a science writer at the California Aggie, so I decided to pull something together based on old interviews to give you all an introduction to some of the incredible and extremely varying research being done on campus. And speaking of varying, all of these interviews have a similar theme. They all touch on the concept of interdisciplinary research. Interdisciplinary just means relating to more than one branch of knowledge. You've likely been on some interdisciplinary teams yourself, in school projects or committees at work. I had barely heard this word before a few years ago, but after beginning to write for the science desk, it was suddenly popping up in every interview I did, to an almost comical extent. It got to the point where I just tacked it on as my closing question for nearly every conversation I had with a source. How do you think that the interdisciplinary nature of this research contributed to its success? The researchers eagerly responded. There were projects where the structure was inherently collaborative, with two scientists from different fields being given a grant to work on a problem or question together. There were other projects where the information from more than one branch of knowledge came from hallway conversations with colleagues or suggestions from friends. Marissa Baskett, a professor and the department chair of the Environmental Science and Policy Department at UC Davis, said that her department deeply believes in interdisciplinary research. Here she is now to tell us more.
And so I came at this as an ecologist. And as an ecologist, it was just thinking about, hey, here are your tools, here are your goals. And, marine reserves were this new idea, using models to say, can marine reserves even achieve this goal? Let's use models to think critically about all these things people are promising about reserves. Which is more thinking about the ecological feasibility of these things. As my career has gone on, and especially this has been the amazing part of being embedded in a department like this department that's a multidisciplinary department with economists, with political scientists, with ecologists, all sitting together and talking to each other, is it expands how you think about these things. Like before here, I was always in an ecology and evolution group, and here I am having hallway conversations with people from social science, and that gets us starting to think in a much more multidisciplinary way. So one of my main projects right now is on kelp restoration, and having this amazing multidisciplinary team thinking about how can we approach restoration as a coupled socio-ecological system or coupled human-natural system, really taking into account the people side of it as much as the ecology side of it, and how do we broaden our scope of how we think about restoration to include support for the people just as much as support for the ecosystem, and where those interventions might take place. And especially as we think with this particular project, the kelp decline was driven in part by a disease outbreak and in part by a marine heat wave, and we know more marine heat waves are coming with climate change. And so how do we think about future climate change and the uncertainties associated with that in this, and how might people be able to be more nimble in response to future extreme events is one of the main questions we're looking at.
Next, I talked to David Donadio, an associate professor in the Department of Chemistry at UC Davis, who, at the time, was working on a project related to clathrate crystals. The word clathrate comes from the Latin word clathratus, meaning with bars or latticed, and fittingly so. Clathrates are a chemical crystal structure that are known for their cage-like frame. The crystals have two parts, the frame and guest atoms that reside within the crystal cages. The physical properties of the clathrates change depending on the atoms forming the cage structure and the guest atoms trapped within, and the researchers aimed to explore potential applications of the different materials created with different combinations. This work involved chemists, physicists, those trained to utilize machine learning and artificial intelligence, and materials scientists. Donadio also collaborated on this project with researchers at Iowa State University. Here's Donadio now to tell you more.
Okay, I think my last question for you is, as you mentioned, even though you're in the chemistry department, you have all this experience with physics and material science, and this project is really a combination of all those. And I'm always really interested in how, interdisciplinary science, it just feels like science always works out better when multiple fields are working together.
Yeah.
So what would be sort of your thought on how this project has been really the interface of those and the intersection?
Well, the project is, if I think of myself as a material scientist or somewhat a physicist, Kirill is more of a chemist, hardcore material chemist. That's the two souls of the project. And on top of that, we have, so we are using methods that have been developed, the electronic structure methods that we are using have been developed by physicists mostly, and we are applying them to a chemical problem. And we are using basic chemistry principles like the Zintel rule and so on to restrict the range of structures that we are studying. On top of that, we have all these new artificial intelligence role that it's a very important role in this project. We have identified a few thousand possible structures, and we cannot calculate them all by using the first principle approach. So what we are planning to do is actually I'm hiring a person, a postdoc who has a PhD in physics, but a degree in computer science as well. Okay. And he will be critical to put together and develop he will develop the software platform that will allow us to finally select the few structures that Kirill would synthesize.
Okay.
And we're making it public, so it's also it will also be accessible to the community, to anybody, and I don't know if anybody would do anything with that, but there's a certain number of other chemists and material scientists that will find it useful. And then these kind of projects tend to grow if there is a community interest beyond the boundary of the groups that started putting it together, right?
In the case of the clathrate crystals, all the collaborators were still scientists. So what if we looked even further into broadening the fields of knowledge included? It took 13 years and $3 billion to sequence the human genome. But over the next 10 years, the Earth Biogenome Project plans to sequence the genome of every other known eukaryotic organism on Earth for a fraction of the comparative cost. One of the key pillars of doing that has been making sure to include the ethical, social, and legal challenges involved. Lawyers, conservationists, indigenous leaders, pharmacists, and more have all been consulted or considered in the process of the project. Here's Carolyn Hogg, the science lead for the Threatened Species Initiative in Australia, to tell us more.
I'm always really fascinated by these projects that are so huge and worked on by such a variety of people in different places. If there's anything you want to add to that and how the collaboration has played into the project and how it'll continue to play into the project.
I think, I think the global challenges we face in today's world, like today, are insurmountable and unsolvable by any one person or any one research group or any one university. I think we will only be able to address the challenges that we face as a species and the planet faces at this point in time by working collaboratively and cooperatively. And you know, scientists have always collaborated and cooperated, even in significantly complex geopolitical times. I mean, you look at World War II and a lot of the German scientists who escaped Nazi Germany, who went to the US and brought all their science with them to the US. So I think that, you know, Earth Biogenome really is a testament to what can be achieved when everybody comes to the table with the same mindset of what is for the greater good.
For our final interview today, I talked to Priya Shulka about her part in a recent project at UC Davis researching gaps in policy geared toward ending human-caused whale mortality. As it turns out, scientists sometimes get caught up too much in, well, the science of things, and forget to ensure applicability and actual change in the form of policy. This project sought to change that by directly addressing policy, backed up by science, and took, you guessed it, an interdisciplinary approach to doing so. Here's Shulka to tell us more.
Absolutely, yeah. So my name is Priya Shukla. I'm a PhD candidate in ecology at UC Davis. And this project is actually part of a larger program, which is the NRT Sustainable Oceans Program. Maybe you've already received a link for that program. I can send it to you if you have not. But the goal of that program is to train scientists to find basically gaps in management or policy, which is not really how scientists tend to think, and use that to inspire questions that they want to ask. And in our case, we realized that there was this really big policy goal that the Ocean Protection Council was interested in, which is to like basically ensure that there's no more whale mortality. They called it Vision Zero, that there's like zero. They were envisioning zero whale mortality. Okay. And we realized that while that's an incredibly lofty and wonderful goal, it's something that there's like not a lot of data to show what even causes whales to die in the California current, which is basically the massive water that's flowing off the California coast. It's flowing south. And so we decided to do that as a group of graduate students that are not only based at Davis, but also at CSUs across California.
Great, thank you. So I know sort of the causes for whale mortality were split into maybe two groups by your paper, sort of the ones that have been more studied and more recognized by policy, and then some of these other threats that maybe haven't been considered as much. So if you could maybe first talk about what the ones are that have been targeted with policy responses, and how policy has sought to target those, but then maybe what some of the overlap of those is with some of these other threats.
Yeah, so to be honest with you, Sonora, I'm not going to remember like all 9 of them off the top of my head necessarily, but I'll maybe give you a couple of examples on like why policy is really clearly implemented in some cases, but maybe not so much in other cases. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, okay, great. I know this paper just came out and I helped write it and I'm like,
I have them in front of me, so if you, but examples are perfect.
Awesome. So I think like one of the key examples that I can think of are things like pollutants, where we're like, oh shoot, we don't, contaminants of some kind are really bad. Like anything that's toxic in the environment might be really bad. And oftentimes, like you can locate exactly what the source of that is. So the same thing goes for sound, right? Like with like something like toxic, it's probably like there's waste that's coming into the water and you can trace where that waste is coming from. With sound, most of it's coming from boats. So like what we do is like change the volume of sound coming from boats. So maybe they just slow down for a little bit. But then you get things like climate change, which is a lot tougher, right, to even deal with, because one, it basically sort of encompasses a lot of the other threats that they're dealing with, like nutritional stress, for example, I think is like encompassed in this idea of climate change. But there's so many different arms and legs there that there's no like specific ship or no specific factory that is putting waste in the ocean that is causing these things. It is like a multitude of factors.
Yeah.
And so while you can target individual things, when you know that there's a much bigger umbrella problem, it's a lot more challenging to create policy to tackle that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously this whole thing you're saying is that, it's challenging to target these sort of broader issues, but theoretically, what would policy that attempted to target some of these newly identified stressors maybe look like?
Totally. So the first thing I'll say is that we're talking about climate change. The first thing we can do, that we can always do, is like absolutely curb our greenhouse gas emissions. But of course, what we're saying here is that it's not just climate change. There are other factors that are a little bit more nebulous and harder to grapple with. And so in that case, what we need is something that's a lot more like strategic. And when it comes to whales, like they're kind of like a very sticky territory, because there are a lot of people who care about whales for a bunch of different reasons, but also there are a lot of people who get like their fingers pointed at them, and not necessarily fairly, for like threatening the whales' lives. So, for example, one of the things we talk about in the paper is this idea that there was a warm blob and an El Nino, and both of these things happened back to back, making the ocean really warm. And when that happens, there's not a lot of food for whales to eat. And so they went exploring further and further, and ended up in indigenous crab traps that also ordinarily wouldn't be there, but the indigenous crab season was delayed because of like a harmful algal bloom outbreak that meant that it wasn't safe to fish for and then feed people crabs. So like climate change basically affected these two things separately, and they collided by making whales more vulnerable to getting entangled in these indigenous crab traps. And so indigenous crab fishermen sometimes get pointed to as a reason that we're seeing a lot of whale deaths, although this is obviously a much more complicated issue. But what you can do is have a panel or an advisory group of people who are both coming from agencies with expertise in managing and regulating things like whales and crabbing. And these sort of examples already exist, and we list some of those in at the end of our paper. And you also want to get people who are on the ground, who know a lot about the system. So you want the fishermen themselves, you want the people studying whales and how they're responding to changes in the environment, and get them all in the same room to sort of create an action plan. Like if we're really talking about Vision Zero, we need to create an action plan that absolutely gets whales closer to that point, but without really affecting people who still use the ocean for a myriad reasons, including fishing. And so that requires a lot of thoughtful collaboration amongst a lot of parties who right now it seems like don't really have the opportunity to get together.
Yeah,
Sorry, that was like not a good soundbite for you.
No, it's good.
Mouthful.
But the idea of the collaboration is really interesting to me. I know talking to, I think, Eliza earlier, she was talking about...
I'm so glad you talked to her.
Yeah, it was great. But sort of this overall program that you were also talking about seems to try and emphasize collaboration. She was talking about ecologists being in the same room with economists. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about a little bit more. You have already spoken to it, but a little bit more about how collaboration plays into successful research and actionizing of policy.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Wow. That's a great question, Sonora. I think the old school way of doing science was that you have if you go back to the 1960s or something, is that you see one person, and the idea was that this one person you could trace as being the person who contributed to that idea. And that's a very useful way of doing science, I think, in the beginning stages. But then as you begin to increase the pool of people doing research, you also get more ideas out there. And so all of a sudden you want to ask questions across ideas, right? where maybe all of a sudden you don't have the expertise you need. And so it's really important to have people who can help you answer important questions that do require not like a really wide knowledge base. So I'm just going to use myself as a personal example here, which is that I'm studying for my dissertation research how what sort of strategies we can use to help oysters survive both warming and disease outbreaks. And I'm a marine ecologist, so I know a lot about how ocean animals respond to climate change. But I know that as an ecologist, and so to really answer this question well, so that it explores the disease part, I'm working with a disease ecologist who works with the state of California. And I'm working with a physiologist on main campus because I'm based at the Marine Lab. And so now all of a sudden, my horizons are really broadened. And well, it's definitely my work, and I am hopefully one day will be the foremost expert on all this. My work is absolutely enhanced by bringing in people who know those disciplines really, really well, because they can see trends and understand what isn't working in ways that I'm just not able to because it's not my expertise. And so with that same idea, if you bring in this panel of people to think about whales and also crabbing and also climate change and also pollution and also things like plastics, right? You're going to have obviously a lot of headbutting at first, maybe, because people have different priorities even, or they might even think differently about how these dynamics work. But the idea is that through conversation that really tries to find the common ground and tries to find the nut of the issue, you can hopefully actually create solutions that are beneficial for most people, or beneficial enough in certain circumstances that at the end of the day, everybody's interests are served. And you kind of don't get that if you have one person with one idea, right? Because they have one expertise, and so they're kind of biased, and they don't intend to be, but they know the most about a couple of things probably, but not about something as complex necessarily as whale entanglement or whale mortality, when there's so many things contributing to it. And that, I think this paper actually also really reflects that, where we had people who are really good at policy, who know a lot about the fishery system in the California current system. And these people came from a bunch of different points of view, and so they were able to contribute to our paper in really wonderful ways, because we all brought something a little bit different that helped us create this holistic image. And so maybe it's not surprising that such a collaborative paper, the conclusion was we need more collaboration.
Yeah.
I definitely think it's a novel. I think this program, part of the reason it got funded is because that's a novel idea, is that scientists are always looking for that spark of curiosity, but often we're using at least if you're like me and if you're an ecologist, it's natural systems. You go out and you make observations, and then you use that to drive your question asking. But rarely are you making observations in policy or management, and because it's kind of actually not how you're trained. The idea, oftentimes in academic environments, is that you're trying to advance knowledge, and be at the that horizon, that cutting edge of new knowledge. And I think what's interesting about this program is that it's not that we're not discovering new knowledge, it's that we're synthesizing, especially with this paper, we're synthesizing knowledge that exists to maybe develop a new idea. And I think that that's actually really key, because we're living in a world where we need to make a lot of changes really fast to deal with things like climate change. And so by looking at what sort of policies already exist and maybe just tweaking them a little bit, or looking at how we're managing things and tweaking those strategies a little bit, maybe we'll actually be able to make some really dynamic changes. Maybe we don't need to come up with something brand new. We just need to update what we already have, which I think is what our paper says.